The phone call from my sister, Valerie, didn't start with a greeting. It started with the sound of a trap being set. I could hear the expensive porcelain clinking in the background, and that specific, practiced lilt in her voice that always meant she was about to pull a thread in my life just to see me unravel. "Chloe, darling, you remember Julian, don't you?" she asked. "The little boy from down the street who lived in oversized sweaters and cried every time a thunderstorm rolled in?" I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I remembered Julian. He was the quiet soul who spent his childhood hiding behind my shoulder, while the neighborhood kids, led by Valerie, made a sport out of his sensitivity. He was the boy who found refuge in my backyard because his own home felt too loud. Valerie continued without waiting for my answer. "It is just so tragic," she sighed, though the delight in her voice was unmistakable. "No one ever invites him anywhere. And since you are still very much single, I thought, why not bring him as your date to my wedding? At least that way, you won't have to sit at the table of broken hearts alone." I almost laughed at the audacity of it. This was Valerie's masterpiece. She wasn't just trying to humiliate me by highlighting my lack of a partner. She was trying to turn my wedding appearance into a sideshow by pairing me with the town's most remembered loser. She wanted the contrast. She wanted to stand at the altar in her white lace and silk, looking down at her pathetic younger sister escorted by a man who couldn't even stand up for himself as a child. I hesitated, a thousand refusals on the tip of my tongue, but something about her tone stopped me. If I said no, she would spend the next month telling our parents how I was too elitist or too bitter to help a lonely old friend. "Fine," I said quietly. "I will ask him." The moment I hung up, the air in my apartment felt heavy. I knew I had walked straight into a cage, but it wasn't until 10 minutes later that the true depth of the malice revealed itself. My laptop was still synced to our shared family drive, and Valerie had forgotten to end a recording session for her wedding vlog. I heard her laughter erupt, sharp and jagged. "Can you believe she fell for it?" Valerie was saying to someone off camera. "I am actually going to bring Julian, the little crybaby. Imagine the photos. Everyone is going to see Chloe walking in with that pathetic wreck, and they will finally realize how desperate her life actually is compared to mine." My blood turned to ice. My own sister wasn't just planning a wedding, she was staging a public execution of my dignity. I spent the next 3 hours tracking down a lead on Julian. We hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. I expected to find a man who was still hiding from the world, perhaps still living in the shadow of the bullying that had defined his youth. I found a number through an old high school contact and dialed it before I could lose my nerve. When he answered, his voice didn't match the memory. It was low, steady, and possessed a gravity I wasn't prepared for. "Julian?" "It's Chloe," I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I need to be honest with you. My sister is planning something cruel. She wants us to show up to her wedding together so she can use us as a punchline. I'm calling to tell you to stay away. I won't let her do this to you again." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I expected him to hang up, or perhaps to start stammering in that old, familiar way. Instead, I heard a faint, melodic hum of curiosity. "So, she thinks I am still that boy in the thunderstorm," Julian said. His voice was devoid of anger. It was almost clinical. "Chloe, I appreciate you looking out for me. Truly. But I think I would like to see this wedding. It has been a long time since I've attended a high-stakes comedy." He didn't ask for details. He didn't sound afraid. He sounded like a man who was walking into a room knowing he was the only one who knew where the exits were. I spent the rest of the week in a state of mourning for a reputation I hadn't even lost yet. I practiced witty retorts in the mirror. I bought a dress that felt like armor. I prepared myself to be the shield for Julian once again, just like I was when we were 10. I had no idea that the boy who used to hide behind my back was gone, replaced by something much more formidable. The trap was set, the guests were arriving, and my sister was smiling. But as the sun began to set on the evening before the ceremony, I realized I was the only one who didn't know what game was actually being played. The day of the wedding arrived like a slow-moving storm. I stood in my hallway for 40 minutes before the scheduled pickup time, my hands shaking as I adjusted the strap of my heels. I had spent the entire week rehearsing for a disaster. I had memorized 3 different versions of an entrance. I had practiced a sharp, protective smile for whenever Valerie or her plastic friends whispered a joke at Julian's expense. I was ready to be his human shield one last time. What I was not prepared for was the man who stood on the other side of my door when the bell finally rang. I opened it and froze. It took me a full second to recognize him, and even then, I wasn't entirely sure. It was Julian, certainly. He had the same dark, intelligent eyes, and that familiar way of tilting his head slightly when he looked at you. But everything else was unrecognizable. This wasn't the change of someone who had simply grown up. This was the change of someone who had been forged in a fire and come out as steel. He was standing in the threshold in a dark charcoal suit, tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin. He wore no tie, the top button of his crisp white shirt left open with a casual elegance that felt almost dangerous. But it wasn't the clothes that stopped my breath. It was his posture. Gone was the slumped, defensive hunch of a boy who expected to be hit. He occupied the space around him as if he had always owned it. "Hello, Chloe," he said. His voice had a resonance now, a deep, steady frequency that felt like it could anchor a room. There was no tremor in it. No need to prove anything. "Julian," I managed to whisper, my mind struggling to bridge the gap between the memory of the crying boy and the reality of the man in front of me. I didn't know what else to say. He gave me a brief, effortless smile. "May I come in?" He stepped past me and surveyed my apartment with a calm that was completely unnerving. He didn't have the twitchy nervousness of someone visiting an old friend after a decade. He looked like a predator who had decided to be polite for the afternoon. "Thank you for calling me, Chloe," he said, turning back to me. "You did the right thing by giving me a warning about your sister. I don't want you to be humiliated because of me," I said, finally finding my voice. Julian looked at me, and for a moment, I saw a flash of the old connection we shared. "I am not going to be humiliated," he said. He didn't say it with arrogance. He said it as if he were stating a boring fact about the weather. But I appreciate the sentiment more than you know. The car ride to the venue was quieter than I expected. Julian didn't try to fill the silence with small talk about my job or how many years it had been. He put on some low jazz, drove with a focused intensity, and only spoke when we were a few blocks away from the country club. "Did you practice responses for when people ask about me?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. I turned to him, surprised. "Yes," I admitted. He let out a short, genuine laugh. "Good. Then you are prepared for exactly what isn't going to happen." I didn't understand what he meant until 2 hours later. The ballroom where Valerie was celebrating her wedding was exactly like her. Everything was calculated to intimidate and impress. White linen cloths, centerpieces with flowers that probably cost more than my annual rent, and a golden lighting scheme designed to make every corner look like a magazine spread. There were at least 200 people there, most of them dressed in that quiet, practiced elegance of the upper class. Valerie had placed me at a table in the very back of the room, near the service exit. I saw it the moment the usher led us to our seats. Table 12. It was the graveyard of the guest list, populated by distant cousins and co-workers who were only there out of obligation. Julian looked at the name cards on the table, then looked at the room, then looked at me. "Strategic seating," he murmured under his breath. "Valerie is nothing if not detailed." We sat down, and I waited for the laughing to start. I waited for the whispers. But as the cocktail hour began, something strange happened. The man sitting to Julian's left, a high-level partner at a law firm I recognized from the news, looked at Julian with an expression that shifted from confusion to pure shock in under 2 seconds. "Excuse me," the man said, leaning in. "Are you Julian Vance? From Sterling Global?" Julian nodded with his trademark calm. "The very same." The man let out a short, incredulous breath. "Good grief. My managing director has been trying to get a meeting with you for 6 months. I had no idea you were back in the country. Julian reached into his jacket, pulled out a matte black card, and slid it across the table. Tell him to bypass the main office and email my assistant directly. I sat there, my water glass halfway to my mouth, staring at my date. Valerie was across the room, laughing with her bridesmaids and pointing toward our table, waiting for the moment to strike. She had no idea that she hadn't invited a victim to her wedding. She had invited a titan, and the air in the room was just beginning to shift. The ceremony began 20 minutes later. Valerie floated down the aisle on our father's arm, her white dress a cloud of lace and ego. It had taken 3 fittings and countless phone calls where she described every single bead to me in agonizing detail. She looked beautiful, objectively speaking, but there was a tension in her jaw that only I could see. I watched her eyes sweep the room. She was looking for the visual proof of her victory. Her gaze landed on me first, then moved to Julian, and then snapped back to me. I expected to see a flash of triumph on her face, or perhaps the anticipatory, cruel amusement she had promised in her vlog. Instead, I saw a flicker of genuine confusion. Valerie had expected to see a shivering, out-of-place boy in a cheap suit sitting at the back of the room. She had expected to see me looking miserable, trying to hide him from the world. What she saw was Julian sitting perfectly still, his presence so heavy and composed that it made the people around him look like background actors. He didn't look like a loser. He looked like the most important person in the room who simply didn't care to mention it. She smiled and kept walking, but the smile arrived half a second too late. I took a sip of my water and looked toward the altar. Beside me, Julian followed the ceremony with a quiet, polite attention, like someone who had nothing to gain or lose from the evening. That was what bothered me the most about him. He wasn't at war. I had spent the whole week preparing for a battle, and he was just enjoying the show. During the cocktail hour between the ceremony and the dinner, the shift in the room became undeniable. Julian was the kind of man who didn't need an introduction, but he accepted the conversations as they came. The lawyer from our table sought him out again. Then a woman who turned out to be the director of a major educational foundation approached us. She recognized Julian from a global forum in London 2 years prior. Then a younger man, an intern at a tech giant, hovered nearby until Julian gave him a nod of acknowledgement. I stood by his side, observing. The strangest part was that I didn't feel invisible. Julian included me in every conversation with a small gesture, a glance, or by naming me directly. It wasn't the forced politeness of a social protocol. It was the genuine act of someone who didn't want the person next to him to feel alone. At one point, when the foundation director went to refresh her drink, I leaned in. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered. "When we talked on the phone, when you showed up at my apartment, you didn't say a word about any of this." Julian looked at me. "Would it have changed anything?" he asked. "I don't know. Maybe. Then it is good I didn't say it," he replied. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. "I am not what I have, Chloe. I never was. The problem was that when we were children, no one saw me as anything other than the boy who cried. And it took me a long time to learn how to stop needing anyone to see me in any particular way." I didn't have an answer. He took a sip of his drink and gestured discreetly toward the head table where Valerie was sitting with Nathan and our closest family. "Your sister chose me because she thought I was still that boy," he said without a trace of resentment. She committed the error of not updating her files. Valerie was staring in our direction from the main table. She had a fixed smile, the kind that requires visible effort to maintain. I was the one who looked away first. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Why did you really agree to come?" Julian took a moment. "Why did you call me?" he asked simply. "Not because you felt sorry for me, and not because you needed a favor. You called me because you worried about me before you worried about yourself. That doesn't happen often in this world, Chloe." I was speechless. I didn't need to say anything because at that moment, the master of ceremonies asked the guests to take their seats for dinner. Julian offered me his arm with the natural grace of a man who wasn't performing. I took it. As we walked through the ballroom toward table 12, I felt for the first time in my life that I wasn't going to need a single one of the witty retorts I had practiced. The dinner began with the order Valerie had planned for months. First, the speeches. Nathan's father spoke for 10 minutes about his son's career. Our mother spoke for 8 minutes about how proud she was. Then Valerie took the microphone to thank everyone for being there. When her eyes passed over table 12, she made a pause so brief that probably no one else noticed. I noticed. Julian continued cutting his appetizer without looking up. Table 12 turned out to be more pleasant than I expected. The lawyer, whose name was Marcus, had a dry sense of humor that made me laugh twice during the soup course. His wife, a pediatrician, had firm opinions on everything, which made the conversation easy to follow. Nobody made a comment about me being single. Nobody looked at Julian with pity. It was objectively the best table in the room, and that was the one thing Valerie had not intended. Halfway through the dinner, one of Valerie's bridesmaids, a woman named Natalie, walked past our table with the excuse of going to the restroom. I recognized her from university. She was the kind of person who smiled while she calculated your net worth. She stopped right behind Julian with a glass in her hand. "Chloe, how lovely that you could make it," she said in that tone that turns a compliment into a weapon. "Thank you," I replied. Her eyes went directly to Julian. "And you are?" Julian turned toward her with calm and extended his hand. "An old friend of Chloe's," he said. Natalie shook his hand, then frowned slightly as if trying to place a name. "Julian Vance," Marcus added from across the table with a grin. "If you ever need seed funding for that startup of yours, he's the one you call." Natalie blinked. She looked at Julian again, her expression shifting from condescension to intense interest. "Really?" she whispered. Julian shrugged. "Marcus exaggerates," he said softly. "I don't think he does," Marcus countered. Natalie stayed for a moment longer, smiling in a completely different way than she had when she approached, and then continued toward the restroom. I took a sip of my wine and said nothing. The problem with Valerie's plan was that it depended on a version of Julian that stopped existing a long time ago, and a version of me that was still waiting to be rescued. I realized then that the rescue had already happened, but not in the way I expected. I wasn't being saved by Julian. I was being saved by the realization that Valerie had lost her power over my reality the moment I stopped believing her lies. But as the lights dimmed for the first dance, I saw Valerie lean over and whisper something into Nathan's ear. Her face was pale, and her eyes were fixed on Julian with a dark, calculating intensity. The night wasn't over, and Valerie was a woman who didn't know how to lose gracefully. The reception was in full swing. The music was loud, the champagne was flowing, and the dance floor was crowded with people who had forgotten the tension of the ceremony. But in the car on the way back to my apartment, the atmosphere was different. The silence wasn't heavy, but it was thick with the weight of things left unsaid. Julian drove with the same focused intensity he had shown all night, but there was a new sharpness in the way he looked at the road. "How do you feel?" he asked, breaking the quiet as we hit the freeway. "Better than I expected," I admitted. "I thought it would be a disaster. I thought Valerie would win." Julian didn't respond immediately. He slowed down for a curve, waited for a long red light, and then looked at me. "There is something I didn't tell you when we spoke on the phone, Chloe." I waited, my heart picking up speed. "When Valerie called me 3 weeks ago, it wasn't just to invite me to the wedding," he began. "She didn't call because she was worried about your social life. She called because she needed a favor. She told me she had a sister who needed a date, yes. But before she even mentioned your name, she spent 5 minutes asking me how I was doing, what I had been up to, and if I was still working in the same sector." "She was checking," I whispered. "She was verifying," he confirmed. And once I told her where I lived and what my firm was doing, the entire tone of the conversation shifted. She became warmer, more interested. "And she still asked you to come as my date?" "Yes," he said, "but not for the reason you think. Chloe, Valerie didn't choose me to humiliate you with my presence. She chose me because she needed a reason for me to be at that wedding. I have been ignoring her messages for 2 years. I sat there in the passenger seat, my mind racing. Why would she need you there? Julian leaned back against the headrest. 4 years ago, I was closing a major deal with two partners for a logistics technology fund. It was the biggest project of my career at the time. One of the partners knew Valerie from university. Somehow, she found out about the meeting and she called him. My breath hitched. She told him she had known me since we were children, Julian continued, his voice devoid of emotion. She told him I had always been emotionally unstable, that I had a history of nervous breakdowns, and that I couldn't handle long-term commitments. She tried to sabotage the contract before the ink was even dry. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. Luckily, the partner told me about the call before the meeting, he said. I was able to clear it up, present my track record, and the deal went through. But there was a week where I didn't know if my entire firm was going to survive. I never confronted her. I just stopped answering. I thought about my sister. I thought about the way she used information like a scalpel. I thought about the way she always knew exactly what to say to make a situation move in her direction. Why didn't you tell me this before we went? Because it wasn't necessary for you to know it then, he said firmly. If I told you on the phone, you would have gone to that wedding with that in your head? You would have been watching her instead of just being yourself? I wanted you to see that her power only exists if you give her a reaction. And why tell me now? Because the night is over, he said, pulling up to the curb in front of my building. And I think you have a right to know exactly what game your sister was playing. Valerie didn't want to help you. She wanted to lure me into a room where I couldn't ignore her, so she could try to convince me to work with Nathan's firm. She used your loneliness as a hook to catch a whale. I looked out the windshield. The street was quiet, the orange glow of the streetlights reflecting off the pavement. I realized then that the trap was even deeper than I had imagined. Valerie had built a plan within a plan. The comment to her friends about my desperate love life was real, but it was also a cover. If I brought Julian, no one would ask why he was there. No one would link him to Valerie's business interests. I was the vehicle for both her cruelty and her greed. I got out of the car, my head spinning. I went up to my apartment and sat on the sofa without taking off my shoes. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Valerie hadn't understood that Julian was no longer the boy who cried during thunderstorms, and she hadn't understood that I was no longer the girl who would sit quietly while she rearranged my life for her own benefit. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from Valerie. Hey, it was so good to see you tonight, she wrote. Julian is exactly the same as always, isn't he? We should all get together soon. Nathan thinks Julian and him would have a lot to talk about. Call me tomorrow. I read it twice. I didn't reply. Valerie had spent the whole night watching Julian move through the room, receiving the respect of people she could only dream of knowing, and her conclusion was that he was the same as always. She either hadn't understood anything, or she was desperately trying to convince herself that she was still in control. I realized then that the best way to win wasn't to fight. It was to walk away from a game that didn't matter anymore. But I knew Valerie wouldn't stop. She was already planning her next move, and this time I wasn't going to be her shield. I was going to be the wall she finally crashed into. The weeks following the wedding were quieter than I expected, but the air felt charged, like the moments before a massive storm. Valerie's wedding had been a social success for her, but the real conversation in our family circles wasn't about her dress or the expensive flowers. It was about Julian. My mother called me twice in the first 6 days. The first time was to gossip about the honeymoon, but the second call was much more direct. Chloe, she began, her voice dropping into that conspiratorial tone she used when she wanted information. Everyone is talking about your date. Marcus hasn't stopped mentioning Julian's firm. Is it serious between you two? We are just reacquainting ourselves, I said, keeping my voice as flat as possible. I had learned from Julian that information was a currency, and I wasn't going to give my mother anything she could trade with Valerie. But how did you find him? She pressed. Valerie said she had to practically beg him to come for your sake. I gripped the phone a little tighter. Valerie said that? Well, she said she knew you were lonely and she wanted to do something special for you, my mother added. She's such a good sister, always looking out for you. I didn't argue. I didn't point out the lie. I simply said, I have to go, Mom. I have a meeting. The truth was that Valerie was already trying to rewrite history. She was spinning a narrative where she was the benevolent matchmaker, the one who rescued me from my single life by bringing a titan like Julian into my orbit. It was a brilliant move. If Julian and I became a couple, she took the credit. If we didn't, she was still the caring sister who tried. Valerie finally called me herself 10 days after the wedding. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Chloe, she chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. How are you, darling? I feel like we haven't talked in ages. I'm fine, Valerie, I said. What do you need? There was a brief, sharp pause. She wasn't used to me being this direct. Well, I was just talking to Nathan, and he was saying how much he enjoyed meeting Julian. He has some ideas for a joint venture that could be very lucrative for everyone involved. Since you and Julian are so close now, maybe you could set up a dinner? Just the 4 of us? I looked out my window at the city skyline. This was the moment Julian had warned me about. Valerie didn't want a sisterly lunch. She wanted a bridge to Julian's capital, and she expected me to be the toll collector. Julian is very busy, Valerie, I said calmly. He's traveling for a major project in the south. Oh, I'm sure he can make time for family, she pushed, her tone shifting from sweet to slightly demanding. It would be a great opportunity for him, too. Nathan has connections that Julian couldn't possibly have on his own. The arrogance was staggering. She still believed she was the one with the upper hand. She still thought Julian was the boy she could sabotage with a single phone call. I'll mention it to him, I said, but don't count on it. Chloe, don't be difficult, she snapped, the mask slipping for a fraction of a second. This is important for Nathan's career. And after everything I did to make sure you didn't look pathetic at my wedding, the least you could do is help us out. I felt a surge of cold clarity. For years, a comment like that would have wounded me. It would have made me feel small and guilty. But now, it just sounded desperate. I didn't ask you to do anything at your wedding, Valerie, I said, my voice steady. And I'm not a booking agent for Julian. If Nathan wants to talk to him, he can go through the official channels at Sterling Global. I hung up before she could respond. My heart was racing, but for the first time in my life, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of a strange, intoxicating sense of freedom. I had said no to her, and the world hadn't ended. Julian texted me an hour later. It was a photo of a sunset from a plane window. Heading back to the city for a few days, the message read, Dinner on Thursday? I smiled, typing back a simple yes. I realized then that Valerie's biggest mistake wasn't inviting Julian to the wedding. Her mistake was assuming that by trying to humiliate me, she would keep me under her thumb. Instead, she had accidentally handed me the one thing she feared most, a mirror that showed me exactly who she was and exactly who I could become without her. The game had changed, and for once, I was the one holding all the cards. The final confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom or a dramatic office meeting. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, 3 months after the wedding, during a family brunch at my parents' house. The sun was bright, the garden was blooming, and the smell of roasted coffee filled the air. It was the picture of a perfect domestic scene, but I could feel the electricity of a storm that had finally arrived. Valerie and Nathan were already there when I walked in. Nathan looked tired, the sharp edge of his ambition softened by a visible shadow of stress. Valerie, however, was in full performance mode. She was wearing a dress that screamed for attention and talking loudly about their recent trip to Aspen. Julian had returned to the city on Thursday, as promised. We had spent the last few days in a quiet, easy rhythm that felt more solid than anything I had ever known. When I told him about the brunch, he simply nodded. I'll be there, he said, not as a statement of war, but as a statement of presence. When we walked into the garden together, The conversation stopped for a fraction of a second. It was the kind of silence that tells you exactly who people have been talking about before you arrived. Julian, darling, my mother exclaimed, rushing over. We were just saying how much we've missed you. Valerie stood by the buffet table, her glass of mimosa halfway to her lips. She watched Julian greet my parents with a calm, practiced grace. She saw the way Nathan's eyes immediately darted toward Julian, looking for a sign, a lead, a chance to save his failing firm. Julian was polite to everyone. He talked about the weather, the architecture of the city, and a book he had recently finished. He was a master of being present without being accessible. During the meal, Nathan finally found his opening. Julian, I've been meaning to ask you, he started, leaning forward with a forced grin. We've been looking into some urban development projects near the river. Valerie mentioned you might be interested in a partnership. The table went quiet. Even my father, who usually ignored the family drama, looked up from his plate. Julian didn't blink. He set his fork down with a quiet clink. Valerie mentioned that? He asked, his voice low and steady. Yes, Nathan said, casting a quick, nervous glance at his wife. She said you two had discussed it during the wedding. Julian looked at Valerie. She held his gaze for a second, her smile frozen like a mask that was beginning to crack. Then, he looked back at Nathan. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Julian said calmly. Valerie and I didn't discuss business at the wedding. In fact, Valerie and I haven't discussed anything of substance in years. The embarrassment was visceral. I saw the blood rush to Nathan's face. He looked at Valerie, his expression shifting from confusion to a cold, sharp realization. He realized in that moment that his wife's boast of having Julian Vance in her pocket was a lie. I'm sure she just meant the potential was there, my mother tried to intervene, sensing the collapse of the atmosphere. Valerie stood up abruptly. I'm going to get more napkins, she said, her voice thin and brittle. I followed her into the kitchen. I didn't do it to gloat. I did it because I wanted to see the end of the story. She was standing by the sink, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles were white. Are you happy now? She hissed, not turning around. You've turned everyone against me. You've made me look like a liar in front of my own husband. I didn't turn anyone against you, Valerie, I said softly. You did that yourself when you decided to use people like chess pieces. Julian was never your contact. He was just a boy you used to bully, and you couldn't handle the fact that he outgrew your reach. Valerie turned around, her eyes red with a mixture of rage and defeat. You think you're so much better than me now, don't you? Just because you're with him? No, I said, and for the first time in my life, I meant it with every fiber of my being. I don't think I'm better than you. I just think I'm finished with you. I'm finished being the person you use to feel superior. I walked out of the kitchen and back into the sunlight. Julian was waiting for me near the gate. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He just reached out and took my hand. Ready? He asked. Ready, I replied. As we walked away from the house, I didn't look back. I didn't wonder what Valerie was saying to Nathan or how she was going to explain the ruin of her latest plan. I realized that the trap she had set for me at her wedding had been the greatest gift she could have ever given me. It had forced me to see the truth. It had introduced me to a man who saw me as I was, and most importantly, it had shown me that the only way to win a game of manipulation is to stop playing it. The afternoon was quiet, the city was open, and for the first time in 30 years, I could hear my own voice without the static of my sister's judgment. It was the sound of a silence that was finally, beautifully mine.